Have you ever been scared or scarred by a film trailer?
I don't remember any trailers that scared me specifically, but I for years and years and years was terrified of everything when I was a younger man. I didn't watch scary things until I was pretty old, but I remember my parents watching things like Unsolved Mysteries, and even just hearing the theme song from my bedroom, I would freak out. I'd be lying in bed having a panic attack from the music because I knew it was scary. But I pretty much avoided horror for a really long time, so I didn't really run into trailers that scared me.
What about scarred? Any that just stick or just tattooed in your brain?
So many, right? In good and bad ways, right? Some of them are just movies where you see it and you're like, oh man, that seems atrocious. And then some of them are, you know what? This is, I don't know, does this count as a scar if it's a positive scar? The movie, it's one of Quentin Dupieux's movies. It's about a guy who loses his dog. And he's searching for his dog, and he goes to see a dog psychic, and the trailer is one of the best things I've ever seen. I would seek it out and watch it over and over again, and then I watch the movie, and it's like, okay.
It's usually how they get you.
Yeah, it was the inverse of scarring. It's burned in my brain forever, but it's good.
There you go, Frankie. What about you?
No, I'm normal. So, no.
Impenetrable.
No, I don't know. I guess when I was in high school, I remember in I think it was an English class, for whatever reason, we were not reading the novel. We watched Rosemary's Baby, and I think the trailer played before it, and the trailer had the lullaby that is at the beginning, and that scared the shit out of me. And to this day is why I will be hesitant to watch Rosemary's Baby, because the trailer scared me more than the movie, I guess, but not any of the images, just the lullaby is scary, and then the rest of the movie. Like I said, I'm normal, so I wasn't scared.
Bennett, how about you?
As far as a trailer that's burned in my memory, it's funny, but I feel like the things that I really remember about trailers is when they've obviously edited them to like cut down a line or cut down swearing. Like I always remember awkward editing in trailers. So the big one that sticks out for me is the trailer for, I think it's the 5th Final Destination movie, the one at the racetrack. Folks at home, if that one is, you know, the 4th or the 6th, please forgive me. But there's a line in the movie where a character yells, "Are you out of your fucking mind?" and then gets like hit in the face by like a tire or something. And in the trailer, it's cut, I swear to God, with like 3 seconds of silence. At least is how I remember it. "Are you out of your mind?" And like to this day, if I texted my brother right now, "Are you out of your," he could text me back "mind." Like we've said that back and forth to each other so many times. But it's funny you should ask about trailers that scared me, because when I think about scary trailers, literally the first one I think about is the trailer for 2004's The Grudge. That for me is the number one trailer that I would like change the channel, turn it off, run out of the room. I was like 10 when it came out, so it's not a trailer I would have seen in theaters, thank God, because that would have been a little more complicated, but terrifying. Something about the kid meowing really freaked me out, and also the death rattle sound. That was something, and it was funny too. Like I can literally remember talking to friends in the schoolyard about that trailer, and they were like, "Oh, I know, it scared the shit out of me too." Like it was like a shared experience among like 10 people I knew that this was a freaky trailer. And it's funny, I was reading a pretty negative assessment of it for Reverse Shot from Adam Naiman, and he notes that it was a notably good trailer. So it's interesting. It's definitely something that stuck in people's craw. And the other one that sticks out as having scared me was the theatrical trailer for both The Haunted Mansion and Pirates of the Caribbean. I found incredibly scary. Pirates of the Caribbean, I was old enough at that point that I was like intrigued to see it, but the Haunted Mansion one, I was like, I'm gonna like pee my pants about a trailer for a freaking comedy. I swear to God, I haven't revisited it, but they play it very much like a horror movie for too much of the trailer, in my opinion.
Bennett, have you ever been to Disneyland or Disney World?
No, I haven't. No, and it's funny. My brother's like a Disney adult. It's funny that that was not seeded with like a childhood trip. No.
Maybe don't go then.
I can't imagine how scary the rides must be. Good Lord. I'm an amusement park guy, as you know. I'm a coaster head, but no, I've never been.
If you promise you'll wet your pants in the Haunted Mansion, I'll go with you.
Yeah, no, it's funny that I'm such a horror like head now, and I love Halloween, but I used to be so fucking terrified of everything now. And I would say roughly like 30% of trailers still make me cry. Like the emotional beats in trailers work on me. 30 is a very conservative estimate there. They work on me like 60% of the time.
You're such a good audience member.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, they really work. I'm proof that they work. I'm proof that people. I don't go see movies necessarily based on the trailer, but I for sure have like the full reaction that someone might have watching the movie.
Ben, I would love to ride the Matterhorn with you because there are these Yetis that when you go around a really sharp corner, there's just a Yeti with glowing eyes. Like, you would lose it.
I'll also say 99% of jump scares get me. I yell every time. So these movies were, in a sense, made for me because they're really nothing but people walking into rooms to be scared.
Hello and welcome back to Split Picks. It's been a while since we fired up the microphones. Last time we talked, I had a fever, Santa gave me coal, and someone named Billy keeps calling me. Seems nice. But never fear, it's October again, and we're all in our happy place, right?
Yeah.
So we have assembled once again a crack team in the Split Tooth Dungeon to ease back into this realm called podcast. I'm Craig Wright, I'll be your host, and joining me today are some Split Picks regulars and favorites. First up, I had to write that. So first up, we have Frankie Veneria calling in from Boston. Frankie, how are you today, and how is teaching 23 classes at the same time going for you?
It's the scariest thing of all. It's just no, I'm well. I'm excited. I remember when I was growing up, I had a friend who was really obsessed with the American Grudge and talked about it nonstop, and was very scared by it. As Bennett had mentioned, the kid meowing was a big part of that. I never saw it when I was that young, but having seen it later and then having rewatched it recently, I can say was not scared about any of it or anything in it, and it was kind of by both the original and the American remake. So
Frankie Veneria, tougher than movies.
That's right.
Tougher than Bennett.
Yeah, honestly, I was jumping out of my seat, I gotta be honest.
And from Austin, Texas, we have Jim Hickox. Jim,
Hi.
I forgot to ask last year, did you actually end up giving out Play-Doh instead of candy to trick-or-treaters?
I'm a kind man. I offer both options. I have them both, and they have to pick one or the other. And a shocking number of kids pick Play-Doh.
That makes sense. You're probably the house they all change costumes and come back to.
Yeah, that's true. We do get a lot of kids.
I wonder why. You have
so
the
it could
goods.
be, yeah. Could be that they're swapping out. They're just taking their mask off, going around the corner, coming right back.
Yeah. You set yourself up for it.
It's true.
And from Philadelphia, we have Bennett Glace. Bennett, whenever we start these October episodes, I feel like something seems to go wrong in your apartment.
That's
Do
true.
you have any sign of cockroaches, leaks, or other spooky intrusions today?
No, but it is funny. A pipe literally burst in our basement yesterday. We the basement's not part of our apartment. It's it's just the part of our downstairs neighbor's apartment, and it has been fixed. Like we didn't have hot water for a little while, but no, nothing. Besides that, that spooky autumn wind rolling in, and there was the escaped convict in the area, and all the people as someone said on Twitter, like reenacting the end of the Night of the Living Dead. Like every fucking piece of shit with a gun in the Philly excerpts was driving around looking to shoot somebody. So that's a little spooky.
Sets the tone for the season, right?
Got me in the Halloween spirit, let me tell you.
So each year for October Horror, Split Picks takes a quick field trip to a different country to find some of the best horror films and directors from around the world. In 2021, we started at home and looked at what we determined to be the Mount Rushmore of American horror. We talked about Tobe Hooper, John Carpenter, Wes Craven, and George A. Romero. Last year, we put on our black gloves and fell in with the Italian greats, Dario Argento, Sergio Martino, Lucio Fulci, to talk about all things giallo. So when we started this series, the first 3 countries that immediately came to mind, and I mean, everyone said the same 3 countries. It was the USA, Italy, and Japan. We all were more familiar with the US and Italy, so we started with there. But this year, we are talking about Japan and some of their famous ghosts, grudges, and gothic imagery. Obviously, Japan has a huge cultural history with horror films that dates back to the dawn of the medium. We're not covering the whole history of Japanese horror in this series because we would be here for years. We're instead going to focus on a few select directors, as we do for Split Picks. I will say, selecting directors for Japan was tough. I think we all mentioned at least 5 names that all would have been great candidates. So we cut the list down to 3. I'm so excited to talk about all these guys, though, because we have Takashi Shimizu, Kiyoshi Kurosawa, and Takashi Miike. For this series, we're going to be looking at a mix of classic and lesser-heralded films from some of Japan's greatest horror filmmakers. Like I said, this is just a quick survey of what Japan has to offer. These directors were selected for a combination of styles that complement each other, that also hint at the country's vast film history, and also how their particular styles of horror compare to the rest of the world. So with that in mind, we decided to kick off this series with Takashi Shimizu and his world-famous series, The Grudge. Particularly, we'll be looking at the first theatrical release of Ju-on the Grudge, the 2004 American remake, The Grudge, which he also directed. And then, for fun, we're going to dive into the 2020 U.S. sequel, also simply called The Grudge, and directed by Nicholas Pesce. So, The Grudge was really a global phenomenon and really put Japanese horror on the map in a global sense. I was in 3rd grade when it came out, and we talked about the trailer. Like, I remember that looking absolutely horrifying. I didn't see it until 2022, though. So before we get going, can I just get each of you to tell me what your earliest memory of The Grudge is, and when was the first time you actually saw it?
When I was in college, I'm the elder here. When I was in college, I remember The Ring came out. Ringu. That's not true. Ringu came out when I was in high school, and I remember that being a big deal among my nerdier friends. And then watching that with them and being like, this is pretty spooky. And then there was a big American remake of that. And then when I was in college, The Grudge came out. And I remember it existing, but I paid no attention to it at all. Okay. And that remained true until a few weeks ago.
Okay. So you hadn't seen them before.
When I watched all 3 The Grudges in a blast to bone up for this.
Frankie, how about you?
Well, it was when I was, I guess, a tween that I first heard about The Grudge. Not the original one. I only knew about the American one and then learned about the original. And I watched them kind of years later, but not with any amount of real interest or curiosity.
Okay. I guess crack team here for this episode.
I generally don't watch any movie with those things in mind or those faculties at work, but I did use them somewhat to prepare for this, but still only reading one chapter of one book to get a sense of perspective on it. So.
Well, Bennett, what about you? Because you and I are closest in age, Bennett. So I think we were both.
Yeah, it sounds like you're
young.
just a year younger than me.
Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, I've sort of spoiled a little bit of my earliest experiences with this. Yeah, seeing the trailer. I mean, to echo Jim, I mean, I even young as I was, I remember the American release of The Ring being such a phenomenon. It's weird. I don't think my parents rented it. I don't remember them. I don't remember them watching it. But I remember a kid at camp like relating the whole plot to me and me listening in rapt attention. Like, wow, that sounds fucking scary. And then I think I honestly probably first experienced both movies by way of the Scary Movie franchise because I hadn't watched The Ring or either the American Gore Verbinski Ring or the original film until probably like 2021, and I hadn't watched any of the Grudge films until like 3 days ago in preparation. Oh no, sorry, excuse me. Besides the 2021, I first watched the 2021, which was released in that it was released in the kind of cursed like January and February right before COVID hit, and I was so pissed that I missed it. Because it got mostly pretty shitty reviews. Everyone kind of, was like, this is one of the worst movies I've ever seen. But I swear to God, I remember somebody comparing it to, like, Fulci. And I was like, okay, I'm interested. And I finally watched it in probably, like, May of 2020, kind of early, still quite early pandemic, and was quite taken with it. And the image in particular that stuck with me is Lin Shaye cutting her fingers off is really, like, burned in there. That's something that, like, hey, 3 years later, I was like, if I think of the 2020 Grudge, I think of Lin Shaye cutting her fingers off, which is saying a lot for a movie that I think we most associate with a lot of pretty like iconic imagery, right? The sort of long wet hair and the kid meowing and the white faces and stuff. This movie has a lot of stuff. The slow walking. It's funny. I mean, it's funny for me when I think of The Grudge. I think of something that no one would associate The Grudge with, because most people, when you say The Grudge, aren't thinking of the 2020 film. They're thinking of the 2004 or the the original.
I left out part of my story, which is I forgot. I did watch when it came out. Sadako versus Kayako. The Freddy versus Jason of The Ring and The Grudge.
I'm so intrigued.
Which at the time, so I'd only seen the Japanese version of The Ring. I didn't watch a remake, or if there were sequels, I didn't see them. And I'd seen known Grudges at the time because it played Fantastic Fest when it came out, and I happened to be there, so I watched it. I remembered it being like medium fun and a little confusing.
It's my sweet spot, yeah.
Yeah. So, but maybe with more context, if I went back and watched it, it would be more fun, or at least less confusing. It might still be medium fun, but makes sense. But that was my first Grudge.
So yeah, I mean, I was, like I said, I didn't see it when it came out, and then I finally saw it last year because we'd start talking about doing this series, and it was like, yeah, we should probably start with The Grudge and The Ring because those are like, the two, I don't know, omnipresent of J horror.
Sure.
But I don't know. Personally, I like the 2002 Japanese version the most of these three, but we'll get into all that later. But stop shaking your head.
That it's already offended.
Crazy take.
But I think it is important quickly to touch on those two films because for many people, if you just say, tell me something about Japanese horror, they will almost certainly say, oh yeah, The Ring and The Grudge. Those two movies came out pretty close to each other, and they really force people to talk about non-U.S. horror. So what is it about those films in particular that were so impactful?
I mean, I think it's a lot of that iconic imagery that we sort of referenced. And I think it's interesting. We'll talk about this, I suppose, when we focus on the 2004 film. But I think it really speaks to the influence of The Ring, how much the American remake of The Ring seems to have influenced The Grudge. The introduction of a little bit more of like a mystery plot. They emphasize the hair way more in the American Grudge than in the Japanese Grudge, which I think is definitely
that's a Ring thing,
a result of it becoming such an iconic thing from The Ring. And there's definitely more. There's more water in the American Grudge. It's a wetter film. I think the image that sticks out for me from a pretty forgettable film is the detective with like the hair on his hand when he reaches into the tub. So it's I don't know. I think both of the films really quickly seem to have like set a standard for this the whole country and a lot of American minds, I think.
They also 2002 2004 was sort of a weak time in American horror, right? Like
sure.
we were sort of getting sick of like wisecracking serial killers, and we weren't sure where we were going. We were like just sort of finding Final Destination, right? Which is sort of how we like ease into
Saw was on the horizon.
Yeah, Saw is like on the horizon.
John
We're like trying to figure out our new thing, and at the same time, these two Japanese movies come out, and the Japanese movies at least are approaching horror in a way where it's more about sort of iconic striking images and less about like jump scares or sassy murderers, right? It's more about like people are in a house and then something's weird and then there's just a kid kind of lurking, right? And you're like, there's a kid lurking there, which is such a different approach. I think there was a freshness and we were like looking for something new, right? I think they landed at a good time to blow up.
Yeah.
And it definitely it led to such a kind of like brief period of like intense fascination. I can't remember what the name of the DVD series was, but I remember there was like a series that would put out like especially twisted movies, not just from Japan, but from like Asian countries in general. I know, like, I think Tale of Two Sisters is like the best of those movies, famously. Yeah, and Miike too became such like an object of fascination. I think he had an episode of like Masters of Horror.
Did he?
Yeah, you can see how
brutal.
the 04. It's a pretty brutal one. Yeah, you can see how the 04 Grudge would be especially scary to an audience who had just most recently been watching like Freddy vs. Jason or like Scream 3. Yeah, it was definitely it was like a jokey period, and I like those movies a lot, but it was like a jokey period for American horror for sure. So something that's really straight faced and like grim. It's probably a breath of fresh air. Unfortunately, audiences, I guess, didn't want grimness in 2020 when they rejected Nicolas Pesch's The Grudge. This Nicolas Pesch's best in the series, The Grudge.
They also a little bit presage the direction horror is moving in now with like elevated horror, which I don't want to talk about because it makes me mad.
We'll get there, unfortunately.
but they like, through being very serious and small, they like become movies that are very much about cycles of abuse and stuff, right? Which all horror movies kind of are that on some level, but they like are a little bit more on their face about it, and they sort of lead the way for where we are now, where movies are primarily about that, and then also kind of there's a ghost.
Okay, and I don't want to get too far ahead of ourselves, but I think it's to the 2020 film's credit that it doesn't do more of an elevated horror thing with the material, because you could really see this movie about like grief living on.
You could get really ham-fisted with it.
Generations. You could get really fucking ham-fisted with it, and I think they will probably before we're all dead. I mean, I think within the next couple of years, honestly, they probably will.
Yeah, I'm gonna pause you guys there. So there's three of you here. We're talking about 3 movies. Can I just get each of you to give me oh no, Jim, come back. Can I just get each of you to give me a quick little overview of which film you're kind of leading the discussion on? So, Frankie, you were nominated to do the original Grudge. There's a lot of history behind this movie. I've read alternately that it is and was not started as a cell phone commercial. There are 2 shorts that are 3 minutes each. But the second one was called 44444444, 10 digits.
It's phone call based, right?
Yeah, and that's the first time we see Toshio. The other one, I don't think it's Kayako, but there is the girl crawling. It's similar, slowly. Yeah. But Takashi Shimizu has said like that is absolutely the basis of the Ju-on series. But then he was a student of Kiyoshi Kurosawa, and Kurosawa actually helped him get the first Ju-on, The Curse, made. And this part will be a little confusing because there are 2 full Grudge films before we actually get to The Grudge. So, Frankie, did you have a chance to watch any of The Curse films? Because there are 2 of them.
I did not, actually. So I've watched only the original 2002 one and then the American one. So I'm excited to hear what's so great, especially about this one.
Yeah.
I don't know if I would say they're great, but there's some good stuff. Did Bennett, Jim, have either of you seen the Ju-on the Curse films?
No, I didn't have time to see the Curses.
No
I want to. I will at some point.
I feel like an idiot for not. I didn't know they existed until after I watched it.
Oh, really?
The original, yeah. And I've just seen the shorts.
Okay, well, they are on YouTube. It's basically, if you've seen Silent Night, Deadly Night 2, that is essentially the format that The Curse 2 takes, where it's like, here's 30 minutes of the first film with a new scene. I think it's going to be fun for people who enjoy Easter eggs, because there's one scene, especially in the 2002 Grudge, that's like, oh, that is directly connected to the earlier films that you just don't have the context of unless you've seen them. But basically, those films were kind of a word of mouth, not quite sensation, but they definitely had a following. And so because of that, Takashi Shimizu was able to make more of a theatrical release form. And Frankie, that is where this one comes in. So can you just give us a bit about what this first Grudge, Ju-on the Grudge, is about?
Sure. Initially, when I was thinking about how I would describe it, I was going to call it a haunted house story, but it doesn't really feel like that, because the ghost or entity that characterizes much of the movie is not really limited to the house in terms of where it goes and what it does and who it torments. So it's a little bit of a misnomer, but it's essentially that. One of the things that's kind of baffling and interesting about the film is that the chronology of when things happen is not always entirely clear, but essentially it initiates with a man killing his wife and child, though you don't entirely see that at the beginning of the opening of the film. It's hinted at, and you can obviously tell, although I think it's more ambiguous about the son being killed. So you don't entirely know why until later, but it's kind of hinted at some kind of infidelity. Then we are introduced to other characters, primary character, or for a while, primary characters of a man and his wife and the mother of the man, who are living in the same house where this murder had happened, and there is a haunting that is still present there. I guess I don't know if social worker would be something. I'm not exactly sure what her, but a volunteer at some sort of social work facility is tasked with going to this home to assist with the elderly woman who lives there and is generally kind of enfeebled, and neither her son nor daughter-in-law seem able to care for her in the way that she needs to be, and that's kind of our introduction to a lot of the plot. Rika is the name of the social worker who's introduced as possibly a protagonist in the movie, but one of the key things with the film is that it swaps perspective between the characters, the husband, wife, the mother at one point, and even some of the more ancillary characters, like the sister of this husband character. So essentially, it follows the genealogy. I don't know if I would say genealogy, but follows the spectral presence of the ghost and kind of what it does to these characters, killing kind of the main ones, the husband and wife, and eventually the sort of social worker character by the end.
And Jim, just to get a quick intro, they remade this as an American film. We're going to go into much greater detail, but for now, how would you sell someone on this movie if they asked you for a horror recommendation and you said, we're watching The Grudge, the American version?
The 2004 specifically American version.
Yes.
It's got Bill Pullman. Hey.
Briefly.
I had no idea going in.
Neither did I.
Very surprised.
I didn't know anything about it.
I turned to Katie and said, "Is that Bill Pullman?"
And then it Mission Impossible's you. They're like, "Here's Bill Pullman, suicide," and you're like, "Okay, all right." I guess
I had no
Bill
idea
Pullman.
about the fractured narrative structure going in
Same.
any of these films. It really took me by surprise.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree.
But anyway, sorry.
I watched this one first, and I'm glad I did. Glad I watched them in the order that I did. If here's the thing, if somebody was like, "Hey Jim, let's watch a Grudge movie," and I was like, "Okay, let's watch the 2004 Grudge movie," and they were like, "Why specifically are you choosing the 2004 Grudge movie?" I would say, because they're all equally good, and this is the one I started with.
There's the short answer. All right. So, Bennett, instead of looking at The Grudge 2, which Takashi Shimizu also directed, you chose the
Which I did watch.
I haven't seen that one yet.
I can tell you a few things.
My
about
new
it,
theory
yeah.
is that American Grudge 2 is probably the best one, but I haven't watched it yet, so I don't know that.
I'll say it's the second best.
Okay, after the one you're repping?
Yeah.
Okay,
So
so maybe it's the best.
So, Bennett, you select the 2020 reboot, which is a chapter in the canon, as the director says.
The untold chapter, you
There
might
you
say.
go. But you selected because it's also called The Grudge, so we're doing The Grudge, The Grudge, The Grudge. I was kind of against it first, but then I liked the idea because it does allow us
And
to
then
talk.
you saw it.
Yeah, then I saw it twice. But it lets us talk about how franchises work, and especially when the original creator is no longer involved, and how they keep going. So can you just tell us why you're drawn to this film, and also just in a sentence or two why it's a part of the Grudge universe?
Sure. Yeah, it's among the things about it that fascinates me is the weird neither fish nor fowl nature of it. It is both a prequel and it's both a kind of sidequel and a sequel
And a prequel. It's a prequel.
The Grudge, and also a prequel. Yeah,
But that's sort of the nature of The Grudge, right?
yeah, exactly. It jumps between timelines.
They're all splintered in time.
But I'm fascinated, as I think I've mentioned in like multiple pieces, by like the new weird franchise machinations that exist now. How everything is both like a remake and a sequel. Stuff like the the what is it, the fifth Scream movie being kind of, I think they, talk about it being a requel. So I was fascinated when this came out, how it was going to, relate to the whole timeline. And I don't know, right out of the gate, not knowing anything about the other two films, it really fascinated me. I'll say it centered largely, or really, pretty entirely around a house in kind of small town PA. Another great thing about it, and it's basically about how the Grudge curse, the titular Grudge, comes back to the U.S. and infects a bunch of people who live in that house, and the kind of cops investigating it. It's got a cast featuring 3 surprise Oscar nominees, not for their performances in this film, unfortunately, but Andrea Riseborough, Damian Bichir, and Jackie Weaver were all kind of Oscar nominees who were considered to be sort of surprise nominees. Andrea Riseborough, of course, recently for that movie I can't remember the name of, the famous one. I don't know. There was the dubious campaign to get her nominated. Anyway, it's the first of these Grudge movies that's rated R. It's the first of these that really leans into the. They're all very unpleasant and suffused with dread, but this one is really good, gory and gross, and it even juxtaposes kind of sentimental moments with especially grim moments, and I don't know, it's got an ending that for me feels almost reminiscent of the Saw franchise. And again, not knowing that the other films had kind of weird convoluted timelines, I thought that was such a pleasant surprise when I, rented this movie for the first time back in 2020. Because I don't know, as you know, I love
it's charming,
needlessly complex timelines. It's fun. It instantly makes a movie more interesting. Why not do it?
Yeah.
So there's the overview, but let's really dive into the original Grudge now. So like we've mentioned, The Grudge began as some short films that, then became shot on video movies, but then it turned into a franchise that has raked in hundreds of millions of dollars. So this really is the little film that could. It, started as nothing and now it's a household name, regardless of your opinion of it. But I like starting the Japanese horror series here because Takashi Shimizu in an interview talks a lot about what scares him and what he drew from to create this series. And I really like how he approaches the ghosts, because he talks a lot about, when they were doing the remake, how they, kind of structured the ghosts and redid them. So for this one, he really wanted to be traditional Japanese ghosts, where the fear isn't so much that they're going to kill you, it's more that, oh my God, these ghosts exist and they're in the room with me. With that in mind, you've all kind of mentioned it maybe isn't the scariest movie to you, but are there any particular sequences that stand out to you in this film? Because for me, there are at least, I'd say, 2 to 3 elite level scares.
Well, again, I'm normal, so no.
Unflappable.
I mean, the staircase scene is towards the end, of course, I think is, to me, the best moment of it, where not with the ghost specific, well, I mean, I guess, but just the white face and looking out kind of beseechingly towards Rika, and seeing a figure when we're seeing the image of this woman who was murdered by her husband climbing down the stairs and looking like she's kind of reliving that moment perpetually, and she's reaching out to another woman in that instant is very affecting. And then, of course, the play off of that is that the husband is also there, kind of lurking. So I don't know, that's kind of the big moment for me, or the big draw. But although initially I was, I guess, when I knew about it, was kind of creeped out by the idea of the kid meowing, it just became hilarious to me after a while.
I found it so confusing, the meowing boy, because also there's a cat, and sometimes the cat's meowing, and then sometimes the boy's meowing. There's one thing about all of these movies is that I never understood the rules, which is fine. They're ghosts. I don't have to, but it made me feel a little bit untethered in all of them. Literally all of them.
And isn't that scary?
It's not. Well, you don't give it more credit than it deserves.
It's a little. I would say, like Frankie, nothing in I think any of these movies legitimately scared me. There's a couple of jump scares in the 2020 where I was like, but jump scares always kind of just make me resentful. But in the first one,
It's an uncharitable attitude, Jim.
there's some stuff that's creepy. There's some stuff that is really striking, right? There's a few things that really, where I was like, oh yeah. A lot of it is just, I love his Butoh ghosts. There's like one big CGI moment, and I was like, why are you doing that? Your Butoh people are so nice. Although I was a little confused why he didn't use actual Butoh dancers who could contort their bodies in crazy ways. Because if you ever watch Butoh, it's spookier than the ghosts that are dressed up like Butoh dancers in this movie.
So, Jim, I'm going to interrupt you there, because that is actually where he said he got the idea for the ghosts.
Oh, I found that clear from the makeup.
Okay, good. Yeah, okay.
Yeah. The one that really sticks with me, and clearly everyone else, because it's in every single version of the movie, but the fingers in the hair in the shower is so good. I was like, ugh, yeah, do that. That was the one that...
Very scary. And, like, very, like, visceral.
It's so brief, though. Like, I think
It's
that is
so
a
nice.
strength, but, like, it
Yeah.
also... I don't know. They could do a little more. But Bennett, you've established you're the scaredy cat of the group, so...
Yeah, what scared you?
How does this film get you?
The one jump scare that really sticks out actually was toward the end when Toshio was like under the table at the restaurant. I really did which I found surprising because I think this movie mostly like steps on its scares with like what the first reveal of Toshio has this like whooshing sound effect under it that just made it like corny. And I thought the score for this movie fucking sucked. I thought it was like a really like Goosebumps fucking like Masters of Horror. The plinking, like creepy piano, did not do the movie any favors. So, but I do think that Toshio's initial reveal when he talks in that like creepy kind of Danny Torrance-esque like, monotone is scary. No wonder it's capped in the 2004 film. But yeah, I don't know. It has it's a creepy idea. But I think only a few of the jump scares really got me. Again, I watched this on my computer.
Well, they're not really
so
jump
take that
scares
grain
in
of
this
salt.
movie. Or I don't read them as jump scares in this movie.
Yeah, it definitely doesn't.
Slow.
It doesn't hit them in the same way the 04 one does. No, not at all.
It's not trying to be like, bah! And then you're like, a thing happened. It's just like, oh, there's a guy over there. And you're like, oh. Yeah, look at that guy.
I do generally like that the structure is that it's just kind of like a series of build-ups to scares, that it's almost like a little like anthology sort of film with just, just moving from like scare to scare. And yeah, I mean, most of them are pretty effective. It's no wonder that it was kept for the 2004 one. One thing the 2004 one, one thing that's worse about the 2004 one, I don't know what the opposite of improves is. The creepy, the video of the husband, killing the woman who would become the ghost is really creepily grainy, and it looks like you're watching like a fucking like snuff film or something. Film. And then in 04, it's like a Instagram filter, like it looks like shit. And I'll say the sheen of the 04 one in general is like bad. It just looks like any other fucking horror film of the era. It looks like
it has no aesthetic goals
like
whatsoever.
Saw.
Yeah.
I don't know, just bland, overshadowed kind of look.
I have to make a sad admission regarding one of the things you mentioned, which was the score of the movie, because I have no idea what it was, because I don't remember it either. Look, I'm a simple...
It's not very memorable.
I'm a simple man, and I look for movies on my television, and then if they don't show up, I just Google them and click on whatever comes up. And so I watched the original movie, the 2002 version, on some website, I think it was Dailymotion, and the version of it that's up there, someone put a different score on top of. There's just wall to wall license-free production music across the entire movie, but it's really artfully done. And so I assumed it was honestly, the whole time I was watching the movie, I was like, there are three things I really love about this movie where it's really doing something, and one of them was the score. It's just so aggressive, and it does some weird, there's moments where it's like playing and then it just cuts out hard, and then comes back. There were things where I was like, I'm gonna steal this from this movie, and then later by the end of the movie, it took me until like 10 minutes from the end, and I was like, maybe this is wrong, and then I looked up a clip, and it's just whoever uploaded it to the website layered other music across the entire movie. So I watched it with this super aggressive score. That's like, it's really, I can send you a link. It's really, like over the whatever emotion is happening, it's doing it to there's like it plays like a cover of What a Wonderful World as made famous by Louis Armstrong whenever we're flashed back to the like couple before they're murdering each other. It plays like really intense, like when the woman gets the sister gets a phone call from the ghost and it's like looking in the hallway. It's playing this like hardcore like 4 on the floor techno. It's anyway. So I watched the movie with intense emotional cues that I guess weren't supposed to be there, but it was good. I liked it.
Okay, that's interesting.
Recommended.
I have to say, I think the strongest scene in not only this film but the entire franchise is the ghost in the bed scene. That one I think reaches some things that are very memorable because I think she's kind of being stalked by this ghost where she thinks her brother's calling her, but then she gets the what's it called, Bennett, the death rattle on the phone.
Ooh, spooky.
Yeah,
spooky.
In this version, it's called the death rattle, and I think it's called like they call it something else in the 2004.
Wait, did they literally say something
with the on the if you're watching it with subtitles, they call it something else. They call it like groaning or croaking. Or
something like rasping.
Rasping, Thank you. Which I thought was in general in keeping with the overall like PG-13ification.
They don't want to use the word death.
Material.
Yeah, they're like, there's no death involved with these ghosts.
Anyway, I just really like how they build that scene because she's like, oh my god, I'm so scared. I know, I'll hide in my bed. And so,
right, insane.
Yeah, she just covers her head. Then she's like, no, the TV will help. And this is the part where I think they do something really great because the TV starts kind of like shaking and morphing, and then all of a sudden the newscaster's face is just like twisted into a vortex, and then you see the lump in the bed start to rise, and you see it before she does, obviously, but then the ghost is in her bed staring at her, and I just really like that because when I was a kid, bed stuff always freaked me out.
Well, that's your safe spot.
Still
exactly. But none of you really feel there's like anything super memorable in this. Like you're all just kind of thick-skinned.
That's a great sequence. No, I think her getting like pulled through the bed.
Yeah, pulled into the bed.
Really memorable, and it's an effect that I think they use in the 04 one as well. Because it's a great effect. And bed stuff always gets me as well. And I had no idea that there was TV stuff in this. I had no idea that was also something that it shared with.
There is. Well, there's also there's like TV stuff, but there's also a bunch of phone stuff.
Yeah.
I at one point I was like, what do phones have to do with these ghosts? I wrote down as a note because I don't. There's like phone stuff all over the place in all of them, and there's TV stuff in all of them. I don't know. I just have a lot of questions about these ghosts. Also, in that very sequence you just mentioned, the ghost shows up and then has to like call her and ask what apartment she's in because it doesn't know what apartment she's in.
Well, I think that's more just it's
and it can impersonate a guy who is still alive, and that's when we learn it can leave the house and just show up wherever. I have a lot of questions.
Well, Jim, I'm going to take a stab at one because I think the phone stuff probably comes from that first...
From that short.
Short, when it was it's a phone commercial, kind of.
Which I have a big question about. Shimizu in general, it made, if my count's right, 8 Grudge movies, right? 2 shorts, 2 Grudge the Curses, 2 Japanese The Grudges, 2 American The Grudges, and across all 8 of those movies, never pushed the formula forward even a tiny bit. They're all functionally identical. He like came up with some ideas in the shorts and then just does them, which I find both admirable and infuriating. I don't understand how if you look at most horror franchises, by 2 or 3 movies in, they're trying other stuff, and then eventually they're like scrambling to get back to their roots, right? So maybe it's the right choice ultimately to just sort of stick with the thing that worked. But how could he do that and not go crazy?
Right. Yeah. I wish he had directed the Freddy vs. Jason movie.
Sure.
Yeah. Because I don't know. At least it's surprising. Most franchises somewhere between like the second or third installment and going back to their roots, they usually start to get fucking crazy.
Yeah.
Friday the 13th, Halloween stuff certainly does. It's really surprising. It's such a like down the middle franchise, which is really why I like the 2021. The 2021 is the one that really throws fucking curveball. It's like I don't know. I find it genuinely upsetting. It's like
also
a grim, gross movie.
It's also such a fertile.
They don't make them like they used to.
The like seed of it is so fertile. It is in my mind similar to like a Final Destination, where it's a great idea that you can push in so many different ways, and it feels like everyone involved with making these movies is just choosing not to.
I just don't know why the 2004 one would bother repeating most of the scenes. I can see why it keeps pulling her into the bed. I can see why it keeps the hand in the hair in the shower, but it's not something that I think most audiences would have seen, so they're not going to be like, hey, play the fucking hits! Because I feel like the whole point of this franchise, like you said, the seed is so interesting. It could be like the Final Destination movie, where it is just a series of like horror set pieces. Why aren't they getting a little more fucking avant-garde with it? Why aren't they getting crazy? Like, by the first fucking remake, you should be getting crazy with it.
Well, and that's part of the brilliance of the 2002 one, right? Is the things that struck me as genius were the score that was wrong, the Butoh ghosts, which are there, right? That's part of it. But then also just the structure of it. It's because I watched the American one first, and the 2004 American, even more so the 2020 American, feels like it's been restructured to be. It's like, ooh, I'm fractured, but not really.
Yeah. And it sticks to a protagonist. It feels like the influence of The Ring. Like we have to have like a Naomi Watts to
exactly. Whereas the 2002 one is just like, here's 4 stories kind of jumbled up together, right? They're like sort of lead into each other, but largely it's just like. It really leans into this idea that like this is a sort of eternal problem now that this house has, or that this area has, and it spreads, right? It's like everyone who dies from a grudge could start a new grudge, and people who die not from grudges could start a new grudge. So I don't know. It sets up this idea that like we can tell stories from this space forever if we want, right? You could do like a what Tremors 4, where it's set in feudal Japan, but in that same spot, and the grudges are happening from that same spot, right? Because we don't know that Kayako's the genesis of the grudge. We just know that the grudge affected that family. So it could be deeper, it could be older. There's like a lot to explore. Well, and in the first movie, it jumps around.
She is the first of this grudge because the whole...
How do you know?
Yeah, right.
Did you read the
opening title
quote?
card suggests that it could happen to anybody.
Yeah. Yeah, wait, no, I want to know how you know she's the Genesis.
Well, the opening title card suggests that, like, you know, anybody could turn into this sort of ghost, you know?
Yeah.
She's the genesis of this sort of line of it seems.
Yeah.
It seems, but we don't know
I feel like that's
that.
why we get that flashback to... Well, I feel like that's why we get this sort of grainy flashback to start, is to suggest, like, here's the origin. And then in, you know, the 04 one, she has that extended kind of, you know, interaction with Bill Pullman's ghost. And
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but it's saying, like, when someone dies in a fit of rage, like, they can continue to haunt the space they were killed in. So
Right, but then everyone else also dies in a fit of rage. So I don't see anything that proves to me that she's the Genesis. But we don't know that her husband isn't being haunted by an older grudge.
Oh, I see what you mean. Okay.
Yeah.
I guess that's true. Yeah.
Like it's certainly
missed opportunity.
The movies
exactly.
imply that is the origin of this particular grudge. But I'm just saying, there's nothing that proves that that there isn't an older one that affected
Jim,
that
I
one.
Did read an interview with Shimizu where he says he was really inspired by 2 things, and it was like classic Japanese horror, where it's like, you know, the ghosts are just here but not really touching you, and also he found that domestic violence cases were like way on the rise in Japan, and so that was like the second main cog of the story, where, you know, the husband finds the wife's diary and she's writing about another man, and he thinks she's cheating, so he kills her. And so I think that is, to me, pretty definitive that this is the start of this particular curse.
Sure, if you want to listen to the author.
I'd love to see a Jim sequel to this series. Just saying.
Me too.
I would fucking love another Grudge movie.
Yeah,
we need one,
they should be cranking these out every year. It's so fertile. Grudges, right? And we know right. It establishes, even in this first movie, that a grudge can spawn other grudges. Although no one takes advantage of that until the 2020 movie, where they send it back to
the Grudge 2. It comes to the US.
Well, so I haven't seen the Grudge 2. No one takes advantage of it for a while. But like we could be spinning off Grudge. There could be like the Grudge Detroit. You know, you could have grudges everywhere.
Oh yeah. It could be a fucking TV series, for Christ's sake. They want to turn everything into an anthology series.
Constant
a
grudges.
Grudge anthology series would be perfect. I mean, Even one of them, certainly, I think the first movie more than the others is like a little like anthology series in miniature, right? I mean, why not? Ugh. Ted Sarandos, are you listening? Come on.
In the logic of the first movie, I guess, to give it credit, like there is a certain sense it makes to have the story, the narrative, like decorporealized in this sense, where it's all just these episodes that haunt each other. And like that, there's a certain logic where that works to justify it for like turning it into a franchise of being like, oh, well, it's really a metaphor for filmmaking. And, you can see that pretty obviously, at least in the, transformation from the original to the American one. Like the scenes being redone, almost shot for shot for much of the movie, like that seems to be very self-consciously a point of being like, well, this past one haunts, not necessarily in a negative way, but it's a grudge that continues and metastasizes and can't be like contained to one geography or kind of national community, which is interesting, like intellectually, but doesn't make it to me interesting as a horror thing. Like I think he's sort of what you're saying, Jim and Bennett, like there's ideas there to push, but to me, they don't really come from the story so much as like the production context.
Agreed.
So I want to throw one idea at you here quick. You've all kind of mentioned laughing a bit at this movie. I really enjoy reading Takashi Shimizu's interviews. He's a really funny guy and he's very sharp. But he has a quote about how he approached directing horror and also his roots in horror. So he said this: I started shooting horror movies because since I was a kid, I liked to scare people. I always loved to watch scary movies, but I never particularly wanted to shoot scary movies. So during the shoot, the atmosphere in the studio is very relaxed and people are having fun. Actually, I like to see some of the audience laughing in my movies instead of being scared. So, I mean, he is approaching this with a sense of humor that's like, yeah, I'm going to scare you, but like, come on, it's pretty fun, right?
Well, yeah, you said that, Frankie, that the kid meowing is like, on its face, a pretty ridiculous image. It's certainly a ridiculous thing to be like, about. Yeah. But I don't know. There was a time in my life, there was literally years of my life where the idea gave me nightmares.
Sure. I mean, I think the death rattle sound, like, I think that is more striking to me than the image because it sounds so mechanical in its weird way. And that seems to like also speak to, as Jim was pointing to, like phones being a thing, the TV being a thing, and just this, not really strangely other, like it shouldn't sound otherworldly, but it kind of does. You can recognize it as like a cranking or a grinding of some kind almost, but in like the way that a machine could be haunted. And that was also one of the things that it raises an interesting idea, again, without pushing it. But I don't know, maybe if they do turn it into an anthology series, maybe someone will do something with that.
So I think I can feel you all itching to get to the American version. So I just want to ask about one last sequence because I watched The Grudge twice. I will say the first time I kind of landed with all of you where I didn't think it was great. But then I watched it again this week and it really, really grew on me in a big way. I think once you know what the film is and you're not expecting like, oh, this is like a world-changing, scary, scary movie that I'm not going to sleep after seeing. Once you kind of know what it's going for, I just think it's easier to kind of get on its wavelength. But the sequence that stood out to me this time, I think it's the fourth one. It's with the the four girls go in the house. Yeah. And this is the one that connects to Ju-on the Curse 2, because that film ends with a realtor selling the house and his sister is kind of a medium and she says, when you sell this house, make sure they try the sake, because if they try the sake and it tastes rotten, they cannot be in the house because they would be susceptible to the curse. Right. And so that's why you hear the girls saying like, oh, this isn't sake, it's rotten. But I love where that scene goes because it connects the girl who runs away to her father, who was the detective who was previously working the case. And I just really like how it makes the whole thing intertwined because it has that weird sequence at the end when she sees her father in the house, he sees her, but they're there at very different times. But it also kind of introduces this, like, which Stephen King movie is it where, is it Salem's Lot with the floating kid outside the window? it introduces like floating vampires basically, where she's like covering her window in newspaper. And it just takes this weird pivot, and like
that was the moment where I was like, because up until that point I was like, I love these ghosts and this music, and I was like, the structure of this is kind of fun, but that was the moment where I was like, oh, the structure of this is what's brilliant about it. Because up until then, everything feels like pretty closely tied together, so it doesn't feel like, it feels like a little serialistic, but not super serialistic. But then they're like, this guy's seeing a scene from 10 years in the future, and that's weird. And then it cuts to that, and then we're just in this world with these girls 10 years in the future for a while. And I was like, this is really lovely. That to me was what was great about the first movie, and that sequence is sort of when you learn that's what's happening.
Yeah, because it isn't immediately clear that like all these things are at different times. You know, it obviously does. Most of it ties together, but that's one where it's like, oh no, this is kind of bizarre in a great way.
Yeah.
Bennett, Frankie, any standout sequences for you before we move on, or are you guys feeling we've covered this?
I mean, it's not a sequence so much as, I mean, just some kind of interesting context or whatever you want to call it. So for the chapter that I was skimming to prepare for it, I was learning about how, the movie is supposedly, so Valerie Wee, I think, is the author of the book, where she has a chapter on both the original and remake of the Grudge. She talks about how it as a kind of reflection of certain, Craig, I think you kind of referenced this, or in the interview that you referenced when he's talking about domestic violence being on the rise when the movie comes out. Because in this chapter, he's talking about how there's like a kind of like what happens to the U.S. after around World War II, where women kind of enter the workforce and gain a newfound sense of independence while the men are at war. And apparently in Japan, there is like a recession that kind of causes a reconceptualization of like traditional kind of gender roles with men not occupying the same position of power or kind of dominance as, the salaried, breadwinner, with women kind of being reduced to a more subservient domestic role. So the movie is kind of a reflection in the kind of male violence that starts off The Grudge as being a kind of reflection of that and of a specific moment for Japan, I think is kind of interesting. And it's something that, since we're going to transition to talking about the American one in a second, doesn't, like, you lose some of that in the transition to the American one that I don't think is necessarily a fault of the remake or anything, but it's just something that kind of caps off like what the movie is speaking to in its original context, and maybe it's speaking to some other things in the American one.
Can I comment on a thing you said a few minutes ago that I spaced out? I meant to say something and I didn't.
I suppose.
You can tell me to shut up if you don't want to. This is just a thing I think about a lot and care about a lot. But in regards to this idea of people laughing at elements of the movie, this is also a thing I make everyone talk about in my class every semester, and they're always like, okay. But the shape of a joke and the shape of a scary thing in a horror movie is exactly the same, right? They're both building a tension and then releasing that tension through something that is surprising but inevitable, as Plato would say. So it makes sense, right? It's the only difference between a joke and a like fright is that one of them feels horrific to you and the other one doesn't, right? One of them has some levity because of the absurdism, and the other one has like a tragedy because of the absurdism. So it's those two things, they're exactly the same. So the only difference between laughing at something, right, and also, as a filmmaker, for me, if you're making like drama or whatever, I think it's different. But if you're making things like horror or comedy, your whole goal is just to make everyone make the same noise at the same time, right? You just want them all to be like, or ha ha ha. And the difference between the like, and the ha 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 is so minimal. I totally get why he would say, I like it when people laugh, because it's the same. It's the same reaction, just happy instead of upset.
Makes a lot of sense to me. Bennett, any closing thoughts before we move on?
Yeah, just we've talked a little bit about a sense of perhaps missed opportunity, or we've also talked about too the ways in which the film we're about to talk about kind of lifts a lot of the stuff from this one wholesale. One thing that is unique to this film: this is the only film in which the cat uses its powers to create multiple versions of itself. There's that scene, I think it's...
Oh, right, there's a ton of cats at the end.
With Rico, when she wakes up at one point with a start, and there's like a ton of cats.
Yeah,
that doesn't happen in any of the
cats.
other films. Probably, I guess, no one wanted to deal with the logistics
with a ton
of having,
of cats.
Wrangling like 18 cats, but they did it here. I don't think it's CGI.
That was striking. I like that. Some of them are stuffed. 100%. Some of them are fake stuffed cats. Yeah. A couple of them just don't move.
Sense. I mean, they don't have to move.
Yeah. But a bunch of them are real.
I guess the other image that just popped into my mind I forgot about is when I think Rico wakes up and Toshio's just like staring at her in her bed. I think he's like sitting like a cat, and then she kind of rolls her head back, and Kayako is like perched like a gargoyle over her. I like that shot.
It's nice.
Yeah.
The elevator scare is really creepy too.
Again, when he's like just standing in the hallway,
closer behind the panes. Yeah. Ooh.
That was one where I liked. This is a very rare example of a thing where I liked what they did in the American remake, where you see his full nude body a couple of times instead of just his face.
Well, on that note, should we maybe go to what the USA does best in remaking horror movies?
Yeah.
All right.
I mean, as I kind of mentioned earlier, right? They just went the like Godzilla Raymond Burr route. They were like, we're gonna do functionally a direct remake, but we're just gonna throw some white people in it, which is such a 100%. Bizarre way to approach remaking. Because I get that there's like some Japanese culture to the setup that they want to preserve. Although, as the stuff Frankie mentioned earlier, the like actual cultural context is nice and makes sense, but doesn't really come through. So all they're doing is making a movie that's set in Japan, but with some white people because they think an American audience is going to be like, I don't want to look at all these Japanese people in this movie set in Japan. So they like have to go way out of their way to explain why, and they don't even really, to explain why all of these white people, like including the brother and sister who both happenstantially work there. It's very weird. It seems like they could have either set the movie, they could have made it with Japanese actors in English if they wanted to, or they could have just done what the 2021 was and moved it to the US and made it an American movie. There's nothing so fundamentally Japanese about a house full of ghosts that want to murder you that they couldn't have moved it to the US. And I think that's its biggest failure, is just that it sort of equivocates. It doesn't really know how to be an American remake, and so it does this mostly a remake of the original movie, but with Sarah Michelle Gellar sort of inexplicably.
Right. I'll say, as far as it's kind of just plopping them into the setting, like my favorite bit of like scene setting is followed immediately by like my least favorite, most like screenwriter hacky. I don't think the 2002 film really does. I don't think there's any like city stuff really in the second one, besides like when the sisters like in the girls building. Oh yeah, I guess they walk around a little bit the city, but there's like a good establishing shot of like a huge crosswalk, and you really get the sense of her being like, like anonymous and this like massive people. It really like there's a sense of like scale, right? And then it's immediately followed by them like by her like looking in on like she's like by her explaining like some sort of like ritual to her boyfriend. Just sort of like they go and look in on like a cemetery. And people are sort of lighting something to sort of spirits or something like that. So I don't know. It's like a hacky bit of like scene setting that sort of also adds like a spooky sort of air. And that I fucking hate that shit. I hate it so much. And then her boyfriend lights up a cig as they're like looking at people in movies always have fucking Zippo lighters. Have you ever met someone with a Zippo lighter?
I have one. I've never used it because you fill it and then all the fuel evaporates over the course of like 3 or 4 days. Maybe it's because it's old, but that's always been.
So it's exclusively for like setting buildings on fire, right? Yeah. I mean, I feel like it's
you have to have a purpose. You're like, it's not like I'm going to keep this in my pocket for when I smoke. You're like, I'm going to go do a crime.
I guess that's why people have them in movies, because they always end up being like plot elements. Something always has to be like set on fire.
Yeah.
I don't know. I like her boyfriend's such a non-character, exclusively just we need another white guy.
That movie also, that scene you mentioned comes after that boyfriend spends like 10 minutes trying to avoid having sex with Sarah Michelle Gellar.
Oh, yeah, 100%, yeah.
This is the weirdest scene in the movie.
All right.
You know what's funny?
We
though?
haven't
They-
even gotten
they
to this
toned
movie
down.
yet. We haven't even gotten here yet. Let's take a break here.
Sorry.
We're gonna call it here for now. It sounds like there's a lot of debate to be had about the U.S. remake, so we're gonna take a short break on our end. Tune back in tomorrow. We're gonna be back striking while the iron's hot. Thank you for listening to Split Picks. Tomorrow we're looking at the U.S. Grudge from 2004, also directed by Takashi Shimizu, and then Bennett's favorite Grudge from 2020. Can't wait.
One of the greatest horror films ever made.
Okay, we're cutting this off.